Dr. Minji Park watched the morning sun rise through the crystal waters of Valoran Prime and smiled as she prepared for another day of groundbreaking research. The underwater research station hummed with activity as human and Valoran scientists worked side by side developing new medical technologies that would help countless species across the galaxy. She had been on this beautiful ocean world for 3 years now and considered it her second home. The Valorans had welcomed humanity with open arms after Earth helped end their civil war 50 years ago, and the friendship between the two species had only grown stronger with time. Commander Ji-hoon Kim stood on the observation deck of the orbital station watching the peaceful blue world below. As the senior Earth Defense Force officer assigned to Valoran space, he was responsible for protecting both human interests and their beloved allies. The Valorans were perhaps the most peaceful species humanity had ever encountered, and their gentle nature reminded many humans of Earth's dolphins and whales. They lived in magnificent underwater cities that sparkled like jewels beneath the waves, and their technology focused on healing and creation rather than destruction. Captain Dong-Yun. Lee reviewed the morning security reports from his office in the diplomatic quarter of New Valoran City. Everything appeared normal, with regular trade ships coming and going, while research vessels collected samples from the outer system. The relationship between Earth and Valoran had become a model for interspecies cooperation that the Galactic Assembly often pointed to as an example of successful integration. Humans provided military protection and engineering expertise, while the Valorans shared their advanced medical knowledge and peaceful philosophy. Ambassador Hyerin Choi finished her morning briefing with the Valoran Council of Elders and felt optimistic about the upcoming trade negotiations. The Assembly had requested increased medical supplies from Valoran, and the terms looked favorable for both species. She had spent decades building relationships across the galaxy and believed strongly in the power of diplomacy to solve any problem. The Valorans trusted her completely and often asked for her advice on matters beyond their underwater world. Dr. Minji Park was examining a new protein synthesis method when her research partner Carl Singer showed her the latest test results. The Valoran scientist's translated name always made Minji smile, and she had grown to love working with these brilliant and kind beings. Their latest discovery could revolutionize healing across the galaxy by allowing any species to rapidly regenerate damaged tissue. The implications were staggering, and Minji knew this breakthrough would save millions of lives. The first sign of trouble came when long-range sensors detected an approaching fleet that was not scheduled to arrive. Captain Dong-Hyun Lee frowned as he studied the readings because the ships were moving in a military formation rather than the loose patterns used by merchant vessels. He tried to contact the fleet commander, but received only automated responses stating they were on official assembly business. Something felt wrong about the whole situation, but he could not put his finger on exactly what bothered him. Commander Ji-hoon Kim received the alert while reviewing patrol schedules and immediately moved to the command center. The approaching fleet consisted of 37 warships from various assembly member species, with the majority belonging to the militant Krex coalition. The Krex were known throughout the galaxy for their aggressive nature and barely contained hatred of peaceful species. They believed that strength came only through conquest and viewed the Valorans as weak creatures unworthy of the resources they controlled. Ambassador Hyerin Choi was in an emergency meeting with the Valoran leadership when the fleet entered orbit around their world. The Council of Elders looked confused and frightened because they had done nothing to warrant such a massive military presence. Hyerin assured them that this must be some kind of misunderstanding and that she would resolve the situation through proper diplomatic channels. She had dealt with the Krex before and knew they could be difficult, but surely even they would not threaten such a peaceful world without cause. The fleet commander identified himself as General Vex of the Krex coalition and demanded immediate evacuation of all human personnel from Valoran space. He claimed that the Valorans had violated territorial agreements and were harboring illegal weapons technology. Ambassador Hyerin Choi responded immediately that no such violations had occurred and requested proof of these serious accusations. The general's reply was cold and dismissive, as he stated that proof was unnecessary when dealing with enemies of galactic security. Dr. Minji Park felt her heart racing as emergency alarms began sounding throughout the research station. The announcement ordering all humans to report to evacuation points made no sense because there had been no warnings or diplomatic tensions. She looked at Coral Singer and saw fear in her friend's large, dark eyes as the Valoran scientist tried to understand what was happening. Minji promised they would figure this out together and that surely cooler heads would prevail. Captain Donghyun Lee was coordinating the evacuation procedures when his sensors detected weapons powering up on the Krek ships. He immediately contacted Commander Ji-hoon Kim with the urgent news, and both officers realized this was not a diplomatic mission, but something far more sinister. The small human defense force in the system consisted of only 3 patrol ships, and they were vastly outnumbered by the Krek's fleet. Even if they called for reinforcements, it would take weeks for help to arrive from Earth. Ambassador Hyerin Choi made one final desperate attempt to reach a peaceful solution as she spoke directly to General Vex via communication link. She reminded him that Valoran Prime was under Earth's protection according to treaties signed by the Assembly itself, and that any attack would be considered an act of war against humanity. The Krek's general laughed at her words and stated that the Assembly had decided the Valorans were no longer worthy of protection. The first energy beams struck the underwater cities without warning as Dr. Minji Park watched in horror from the research station windows. Brilliant flashes of light erupted beneath the waves as schools and hospitals were targeted deliberately. She could see Valoran families trying to flee to deeper waters, but the weapons followed them into the depths with ruthless efficiency. Coral Singer cried out in anguish as her home city began to collapse, and Minji held her friend close while tears streamed down her own face. Commander Ji-hoon Kim ordered his ships to engage the enemy fleet, even though he knew it was hopeless. The human vessels were fast and well-armed, but they faced overwhelming odds against ships designed for planetary bombardment. He watched helplessly as the beautiful world below was systematically destroyed while millions of innocent Valorans died in their homes. This was not war but genocide, and it went against every principle the Assembly claimed to represent. Captain Donghyun Lee tried desperately to coordinate rescue efforts as Valoran refugees streamed toward human facilities seeking protection. The orbital elevators had been destroyed in the first wave of attacks, leaving thousands trapped in the burning cities below. He could hear Valoran younglings calling for help over the emergency channels, and the sound would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Kreks were not just destroying military targets, but deliberately targeting civilians, including children and the elderly. Ambassador Hyerin Choi was preparing to broadcast a final message to Earth when Krek soldiers stormed the diplomatic compound. She managed to send a brief transmission warning that Valoran Prime was under attack before the communication arrays were destroyed. The soldiers showed no mercy as they executed the human diplomatic staff one by one while forcing her to watch. She faced her death with dignity, knowing that Earth would eventually learn the truth about what happened here. Dr. Minji Park was helping wounded Valorans when the research station came under direct attack. The structure began to collapse around them as she tried to get her patients to the escape pods. Coral Singer was badly injured, but insisted that Minji save herself rather than stay behind. The human scientist refused to abandon her friend, and together they made it to the last functioning pod as the station exploded behind them. She watched her second home burn while holding the dying Valoran scientist who had become like a sister to her. The slaughter continued for 6 hours until every Valoran city lay in ruins and no life signs remained on the planet's surface. General Vex ordered his ships to hunt down any survivors hiding in the deep ocean trenches while human witnesses were systematically eliminated. The beautiful world that had been a symbol of peace and cooperation was transformed into a graveyard where millions of innocent beings had died for no reason other than Krek's hatred of weakness. Lieutenant Ji-won-yoon managed to escape in a damaged courier ship as the last human survivor of the massacre. She had been delivering supplies to a remote research outpost when the attack began and watched the horror unfold from hiding. Her ship was badly damaged by radiation from the weapons used against Valoran Prime, but she managed to jury-rig the engines for one final jump toward Earth. Behind her, the Krek's fleet began broadcasting false reports claiming the Valorans had attacked first and that human casualties were minimal and regrettable. Lieutenant Ji-won-yoon's damaged courier ship limped through space for 3 weeks before reaching the outer defense perimeter of the Sol system. Her vessel was barely holding together, and radiation poisoning had left her weak and sick, but she carried information that would change everything. The defense grid scanners detected her approach, and military vessels rushed to intercept what appeared to be a derelict ship drifting toward Earth. When they realized it was a human vessel, the rescue became urgent as medical teams prepared for the worst. General Seokjin Nam was reviewing routine defense reports when the emergency alert reached his desk. A survivor from Valoran Prime had arrived and was being rushed to the military medical center on Luna Base. The general felt his blood turn cold because, according to official assembly reports, there had been only minor human casualties during what they called a regrettable incident. He immediately ordered the highest security protocols and placed a communication blackout on all information regarding the survivor until he could assess the situation personally. President Yoonji Kong was awakened in the middle of the night by her security chief, who informed her that something terrible had happened at Valoran Prime. The initial reports from the assembly had been confusing and contradictory, but she had trusted their assurance that all humans were safe. Now, a badly injured survivor was being treated by Earth's best doctors, while General Nam demanded an immediate meeting with the Emergency Council. She dressed quickly and prepared herself for news that would shake the foundation of everything they believed about galactic civilization. Dr. Young-Soo Shin was pulled from his research laboratory, where he had been working on theoretical military scenarios that most people hoped would never be needed. As Earth's leading expert on asymmetric warfare, he had spent years studying the weaknesses of various alien species and developing strategies that took advantage of human adaptability. His work was classified at the highest levels because the methods he proposed would be considered barbaric by galactic standards. The call to the Emergency Council told him his theories might soon become reality. Lieutenant Ji-won-yoon woke up in the medical bay 3 days after her arrival to find herself surrounded by doctors and military officers. Her body was healing, but the memories of what she had witnessed remained crystal clear and terrible. She looked at General Nam and saw the grim expression on his face as he waited for her report. Taking a deep breath, she began to tell the story of how an entire peaceful species had been systematically exterminated while the galaxy watched and did nothing. The testimony she gave over the next 6 hours painted a picture of horror that none of the assembled officers could have imagined. The Kreks had not simply attacked military targets, but had deliberately targeted schools, hospitals, and civilian shelters. Families had been hunted down in their homes while children were killed in front of their parents. The beautiful underwater cities had been reduced to rubble and corpses, while Krek soldiers laughed at the screams of their victims. This was not war, but genocide committed by members of the same assembly that claimed to represent peace and order. President Yoonji Kang felt sick as she listened to the recordings that Lieutenant Yoon had managed to save from her ship's databanks. The voices of Valoran younglings calling for help mixed with the sounds of explosions and the cruel laughter of Krek soldiers. Ambassador Hyerin Choi's final transmission, warning Earth about the attack, had been her last act before being executed, along with the rest of the diplomatic staff. The woman who had devoted her life to peace had died trying to warn her people about the betrayal of everything she believed in. The official assembly report arrived 12 hours after Lieutenant Yoon's testimony, and it was filled with lies from beginning to end. According to their version, the Valorans had been developing illegal weapons and had attacked the inspection fleet when confronted with evidence of their crimes. Human casualties were listed as minimal and regrettable, while the destruction of Valoran cities was described as necessary to prevent the spread of dangerous technology. The report concluded by demanding that Earth accept the unfortunate necessity of Valoran extinction for the sake of galactic stability. General Seokjin Nam called an emergency meeting of the Defense Council and presented classified information that had been kept secret for decades. Project Silent Thunder was a comprehensive military doctrine based on the assumption that Earth would eventually face enemies too powerful to defeat through conventional means. Human military theorists had studied every species in the galaxy and identified weaknesses that could be exploited through psychological warfare, biological weapons, and tactics that other species would consider unthinkable. Dr. Young-Soo Shin unveiled the research he had been conducting in hidden facilities across the solar system. Humans had developed weapons specifically designed to target the biological and psychological vulnerabilities of different alien species. These weapons did not simply kill, but caused terror and madness that would spread through enemy populations, like a plague. The galactic community had banned such research because they feared what humanity might create if pushed too far. President Yoonji Kong faced the most difficult decision in human history as she considered Earth's options. The Assembly controlled the major trade routes and commanded fleets that outnumbered human forces by more than 10 to 1. Open defiance seemed like suicide that would only result in Earth sharing the same fate as Valoran Prime. However, the recordings of dying Valoran children haunted her dreams, and she knew that accepting this injustice would make humanity complicit in genocide. The Emergency Council debated through the night as representatives argued for caution against those demanding immediate retaliation. Some believed that Earth should accept the Assembly's version of events and continue working within the system to prevent future tragedies. Others pointed out that the Valorans had trusted the system and it had failed them completely while their friends and allies were slaughtered like animals. The divide threatened to tear apart Earth's government at the moment when unity was most needed. Lieutenant Jiwon Yoon was recovering in the medical bay when she received a visit from President Kang, who wanted to hear the testimony firsthand. The young officer described watching Coral Singer die in her arms, while the research station burned around them. She spoke of families torn apart and children murdered for no reason other than Krek's hatred of peace. Her voice remained steady, but tears ran down her face as she begged the president not to let these deaths be meaningless. Dr. Young-Soo Shin presented his strategic analysis to the full Emergency Council, showing them exactly what humanity was capable of when fighting without restraint. The weapons and tactics he had developed would not simply defeat enemy fleets, but would break the will of entire species to continue fighting. Psychological warfare could turn allies against each other, while biological agents could make whole worlds uninhabitable for specific species. The methods were terrible, but they were also effective against enemies who showed no mercy to the innocent. General Seokjin Nam revealed that Earth had been secretly building a shadow fleet of vessels using technology reverse-engineered from captured alien equipment. These ships could travel through folded space without using the traditional routes monitored by the Assembly, and they carried weapons that exploited the weaknesses identified in Project Silent Thunder. The fleet was small, but it had been designed for surgical strikes that would cause maximum psychological impact rather than simply destroying enemy forces. President Yoon-ji Kang stood before the Emergency Council and made her decision after reviewing all the evidence and options available. She thought of Ambassador Hyerin Choi, who had died believing in the power of diplomacy, and Dr. Minji Park, who had worked to heal the galaxy only to watch her friends be murdered. The Assembly had chosen to make Earth their enemy by slaughtering innocent allies, and they would learn why that was the worst mistake they could have made. The President's declaration was broadcast simultaneously to every human world and colony as she explained what had really happened at Valoran Prime. The lies told by the Assembly were exposed, while the truth about Valoran genocide was revealed to humanity. She announced that Earth would no longer recognize Assembly authority and would respond to their crimes with appropriate force. The message was simple and direct, but it carried the weight of human fury that had been building for weeks. General Nam activated Project Silent Thunder as human military forces across the galaxy received their orders to begin operations against Assembly targets. The Shadow Fleet emerged from hidden bases while special operations teams prepared to infiltrate enemy worlds using technology the aliens had never seen before. Earth's response would not be a conventional war fought according to galactic rules, but something far more terrifying that would exploit every weakness and fear of their enemies. Dr. Young-Soo Shin coordinated the deployment of weapons that had been developed in secret for exactly this scenario. Biological agents designed to target specific alien nervous systems were loaded onto stealth delivery vehicles, while psychological warfare specialists prepared broadcasts that would shatter enemy morale. The methods were brutal, but they were being used against beings who had murdered children and laughed while doing it. Admiral Woojin Cho stood on the bridge of the stealth ship Retribution as it materialized from folded space near the Assembly Research Facility at Kepler Station. The massive structure hung in orbit around a dead world where the Assembly conducted experiments too horrible to perform near civilized systems. Intelligence reports suggested that Valoran prisoners were being held here for biological research, and Admiral Cho intended to rescue any survivors while gathering evidence of Assembly war crimes. His Shadow Fleet had been waiting for this moment for decades, and now they would show the galaxy what human military engineering could accomplish. Colonel Soyeon Han led her special operations team through the ventilation systems of Assembly Command, Station Alpha using quantum stealth suits that rendered them invisible to all known detection methods. The technology had been developed by studying alien sensor systems and creating materials that existed partially outside normal space-time. Her mission was to infiltrate the central computer core and plant viruses that would turn the Assembly's own artificial intelligence systems against them. The aliens had become dependent on automated systems, and that dependency would become their greatest weakness. Major Kyungmin Bae worked from a hidden facility beneath Europa's ice as she coordinated cyber attacks against assembly networks across 3 sectors. The viruses she had created were designed to exploit the specific neural patterns of different alien species by mimicking the thought processes that their computers were built to recognize. When these systems became infected, they would begin to perceive their own operators as enemies, while following increasingly irrational commands that would spread chaos throughout assembly space. Captain Nara Lim guided her ship through dimensions that existed between normal space as she approached the heavily defended assembly shipyard at Arcturus Prime. Her vessel could phase in and out of reality at will, making it impossible for enemy sensors to maintain target locks while her weapons fired from angles that should have been physically impossible. The shipyard was building the next generation of assembly dreadnoughts, and destroying it would set back their military expansion by several years. The first sign that something had gone terribly wrong for the assembly came when their command networks began reporting impossible sensor readings across dozens of systems. Ships appeared and disappeared without using known faster-than-light technology, while bases reported intruders that their security systems could not detect. The attacks seemed random at first, but assembly intelligence officers soon realized they were facing an enemy that fought by completely different rules than any species they had encountered before. Colonel Soyeon Han's infiltration of Command Station Alpha succeeded beyond all expectations, as her viruses spread through the Assembly's primary communication network. The artificial intelligence systems that controlled everything from life support to weapons targeting began to malfunction in ways that seemed almost malicious. Doors sealed randomly, trapping personnel in sections of the station, while elevators carried passengers to wrong destinations, and security systems turned on their own operators. Admiral Woo Jin Cho led the assault on Kepler Station after his scouts confirmed the presence of Valoran prisoners in the research laboratories. The rescue operation revealed horrors that shocked even veteran human soldiers who thought they had seen the worst that war could offer. The Valorans had not simply been killed, but had been dissected while still alive, so that assembly scientists could study their peaceful nature and find ways to weaponize it for psychological warfare against other species. The few surviving Valorans were barely alive after months of torture and experimentation, but they managed to provide testimony about assembly research programs that had been operating for decades. Entire species had been studied and cataloged with their weaknesses documented for future exploitation. The assembly had been planning systematic genocide of peaceful races across the galaxy while presenting themselves as guardians of civilization and order. Captain Nara Lim struck the Arcturus shipyard with surgical precision as her ship phased through their defensive shields and planted antimatter charges in the construction bays. The explosions were timed to maximize psychological impact, as the most advanced ships in the assembly fleet were destroyed while still under construction. The workers who survived spread stories about ghost ships that could appear anywhere and strike without warning. Major Kyungmin Bae's cyber warfare campaign reached its full potential as assembly computer systems across multiple sectors began to turn against their operators. Automated defense platforms fired on friendly ships, while navigation computers sent vessels into stars or black holes. The chaos spread through their networks like a plague as each infected system contaminated others with viruses designed to exploit alien psychology in ways they could not understand or counter. The assembly leadership called an emergency session, as reports flooded in about attacks that defied all known laws of physics and warfare. Human forces seemed to appear anywhere in the galaxy without warning, while their weapons and tactics were unlike anything in the historical databases. Some council members suggested negotiating with Earth, but the Krek's representatives insisted that showing weakness would only encourage more human aggression. Colonel Soyeon Han extracted her team from Command Station Alpha after planting evidence that would implicate several assembly species in war crimes against their own allies. Foe Documents were carefully crafted to appear authentic, while revealing collaborations and betrayals that would shatter trust between member races. Soon the assembly would be fighting internal conflicts as much as external threats, while humans watched their enemies destroy each other. Admiral Wu Jin-cho broadcast the evidence gathered from Kepler Station across assembly space using hijacked communication networks. The recordings of Valoran torture sessions and documentation of planned genocides against peaceful species were transmitted to every world simultaneously. Many assembly member races had never known about these programs, and their populations began to demand answers from governments that had kept them in ignorance. The rescue of Valoran survivors became a powerful propaganda tool as Earth forces ensured that every being in the galaxy heard their testimony about assembly atrocities. The peaceful species that the assembly claimed to protect realized they were actually targets for future experimentation and elimination. Several minor races began secretly negotiating with human representatives, while others simply withdrew from assembly space entirely. Captain Nara Lim led a coordinated strike against 12 assembly facilities simultaneously as her task force demonstrated the reach of human space-folding technology. Research stations, weapons depots, and communication relays were destroyed across thousands of light-years in the span of minutes, while assembly forces struggled to understand how such coordination was possible. The attacks sent a clear message that nowhere in the galaxy was safe from human retaliation. Major Kyungmin Bae introduced new virus variants that specifically targeted the Krek's neural networks, causing them to experience the fear and helplessness they had inflicted on the Valorans. Krek's soldiers began reporting hallucinations of dying Valoran children, while their command systems showed phantom enemy fleets that did not exist. The proud warrior race found themselves jumping at shadows as their own technology turned against them. The psychological impact of human tactics began to spread beyond the direct targets as assembly populations realized they faced an enemy that seemed capable of striking anywhere at any time. Trade between worlds slowed to a trickle as merchant ships refused to travel routes that might be monitored by invisible human vessels. The economy that held the assembly together began to crumble under the weight of fear and uncertainty. Colonel Soyeon Han coordinated simultaneous infiltrations of 17 assembly intelligence facilities to gather information about their military capabilities and political weaknesses. The human special forces teams moved like ghosts through enemy installations, taking what they needed while leaving behind evidence that would fuel paranoia and distrust between different species. Soon assembly members would suspect each other, more than they feared human attacks. Admiral Wu Jin-cho received reports from across the Shadow Fleet about successful operations against targets throughout assembly space. Human forces had struck over 200 facilities in the first month of operations while suffering minimal casualties themselves. The enemy was learning that humanity's approach to warfare was fundamentally different from anything they had faced before, because humans fought not just to win, but to ensure their enemies would never threaten innocence again. The assembly tried to respond with conventional military force by dispatching large fleets to hunt down human raiders, but found themselves fighting shadows that refused to engage in traditional space battles. When their ships arrived at attack sites, they found only wreckage and broadcast messages reminding them that this was justice for Valoran Prime. The massive fleets that were the assembly's greatest strength became liabilities that consumed resources, while accomplishing nothing. Captain Nara Lim led her task force in an attack on the Assembly's primary intelligence headquarters, located in a space station hidden within an asteroid field. Fleet Admiral Sang-hoon Jang stood in the war room beneath Luna Base as he coordinated the largest military campaign in human history. 6 months had passed since the Valoran massacre, and Earth's response had evolved from targeted strikes to systematic warfare against the entire assembly structure. Holographic displays showed the status of operations across hundreds of star systems, while intelligence reports documented the collapse of enemy morale and infrastructure. The aliens had learned too late that humans possessed a talent for sustained warfare that went far beyond anything they had imagined possible. Dr. Yoonji Lee worked in a secure laboratory, developing the next generation of biological weapons specifically designed to target assembly member species without harming neutral populations. Her creations did not kill quickly, but instead caused psychological breakdown and social collapse by exploiting the unique neural structures of different alien races. The Kreks experienced overwhelming guilt and remorse for their violent nature, while the bureaucratic Zentari became unable to make decisions or follow orders. Each weapon was precisely calibrated to create maximum disruption with minimal actual death. Commander Min-hyuk Kim led the ground assault forces that had become legendary throughout assembly space for their combination of enhanced human soldiers, and captured alien technology. His troops moved through enemy installations like unstoppable forces of nature while showing mercy to civilians and demonstrating creativity in psychological warfare that broke enemy morale. The stories of human soldiers who fought like demons but spared the innocent spread fear and confusion among assembly populations who could not understand enemies that followed such contradictory principles. Intelligence Director Haeun Park orchestrated the information war from a hidden facility that monitored communications across the galaxy. Her team had turned the Assembly's own networks against them by broadcasting evidence of war crimes and corruption while sowing discord between member species. The truth about decades of planned genocides and systematic oppression was spreading faster than Assembly censors could contain it, and entire worlds were beginning to question their loyalty to leaders who had betrayed their trust. The Kreks Coalition had discovered that their proudest warships were vulnerable to weapons that attacked their crews rather than their hulls. Dr. Yoonji Lee's biological agents spread through ventilation systems, causing Kreks soldiers to experience the terror and helplessness they had inflicted on others. Proud warriors found themselves weeping uncontrollably as they relived the memories of Valoran children crying for help, while their commanders struggled to maintain discipline among troops who could no longer function as effective fighters. Commander Min-hyuk Kim's forces struck the heavily fortified assembly stronghold at Rigel Station using tactics borrowed from Earth's most brutal historical conflicts. Human soldiers enhanced with alien biotechnology proved unstoppable in close combat, while their psychological warfare specialists broadcasted recordings of Valoran genocide to enemy troops. The defenders surrendered after 3 days when their own supporters began turning against them rather than continue fighting for leaders who murdered innocents. Fleet Admiral Sang-hoon Jang reviewed the strategic situation and saw that the assembly was beginning to fragment as member species lost faith in central authority. Intelligence reports showed 17 different races had begun secret negotiations with Earth, while others were simply withdrawing from assembly space to avoid being caught in the spreading conflict. The economic and political systems that held the alliance together were breaking down under the weight of fear and mistrust. Intelligence Director Haeun Park had successfully turned 5 assembly intelligence agencies against each other by providing each with evidence that their allies were planning betrayals. The paranoia spread through their leadership as former friends became suspected enemies, while resources were diverted from fighting humans to monitoring internal threats. Soon the assembly would be spending more effort watching themselves than trying to coordinate military operations against Earth. Dr. Yoonji Lee introduced a new class of psychological weapons that specifically targeted the Zentari bureaucratic class who formed the administrative backbone of assembly government. The biological agent caused an inability to process complex information or make decisions, which effectively paralyzed their entire governmental system. Trade agreements went unsigned while military orders remained unprocessed, as the species that managed assembly logistics became incapable of performing their functions. The assembly's attempt to end the conflict by targeting Earth directly resulted in the largest space battle in galactic history when their combined fleet arrived in the Sol system. 12 different species had contributed ships to an armada that numbered over 3,000 vessels, representing the largest military force ever assembled. They expected to find Earth's homeworld defended by the handful of patrol ships that had been visible in previous conflicts. Instead, they encountered the complete Earth defense grid that had been under construction for 50 years in preparation for exactly this scenario. Hidden installations throughout the solar system revealed themselves as automated defense platforms emerged from asteroid bases, and the full Shadow Fleet materialized from folded space. The human defenders were outnumbered 10-1, but they had chosen the battlefield and prepared every advantage that human engineering could provide. Fleet Admiral Sang-hoon Jang commanded the defense from a mobile command ship that could phase in and out of normal space, while coordinating attacks from multiple dimensions simultaneously, The assembly fleet found themselves fighting enemies that appeared and disappeared at will, while their own weapons seemed unable to find targets in the maze of spatial distortions that surrounded Earth. Human tactics turned the entire solar system into a trap where superior numbers became a liability rather than an advantage. The Battle of Sol became known as the Sol Slaughter when human forces destroyed the massive assembly armada without losing a single vessel. Commander Min-hyuk Kim led boarding parties that captured key enemy ships, while Dr. Yoonji Lee's biological weapons spread through the fleet, causing mass surrenders as alien crews became unable to continue fighting. The few ships that escaped carried tales of human capabilities that seemed to violate the fundamental laws of physics and warfare. Intelligence Director Haeun Park ensured that recordings of the battle were broadcast throughout assembly space, showing how their greatest military effort had been crushed by forces they could not understand or counter. The psychological impact was devastating as populations that had believed in assembly military supremacy realized their protectors were helpless against human technology. Confidence in assembly leadership collapsed as member species began to openly discuss withdrawal from the alliance. The aftermath of the Sol Slaughter triggered a cascade of defections as 8 major assembly member races announced their immediate withdrawal from the alliance rather than face the possibility of human retaliation. The Valoran agricultural worlds declared independence, while the Thorian mining colonies severed all ties with assembly government. Each departure weakened the remaining alliance while strengthening Earth's position as species sought protection from the power that had proven capable of defending itself, Dr. Yoonji Lee's research had expanded beyond biological weapons to include psychological conditioning techniques that could reprogram enemy populations to reject violence and embrace peaceful cooperation. The methods were applied to captured assembly personnel, who were then returned to their homes carrying new ideas about the futility of war and the value of cooperation. The effect spread through enemy populations like a beneficial plague that undermined their will to continue fighting. Commander Min-hyuk Kim established military bases on abandoned assembly worlds where human forces could operate freely while providing protection to refugee populations fleeing the chaos. These bases became centers of humanitarian aid, where Earth's medical and engineering expertise was used to help species that had been oppressed by assembly rule. The contrast between human behavior and assembly brutality was not lost on populations. Throughout the galaxy, Fleet Admiral Sang-hoon Jang received reports that the remaining assembly leadership was fracturing as different factions blamed each other for the military disasters and political collapse. The Kreks wanted to continue fighting while more moderate species sought a negotiated settlement that might preserve some remnant of their alliance. The debates became increasingly bitter as former allies turned against each other with accusations of incompetence and betrayal. Intelligence. Director Haeun Park exploited these divisions by providing different factions with carefully crafted intelligence that seemed to confirm their worst suspicions about their allies. The Kreks received evidence that moderate species were planning to surrender Earth secrets, while the moderates learned about Kreks' plans to sacrifice other races in desperate last stands. Soon, the Assembly Council was spending more time fighting internal battles than planning military operations. The economic collapse that followed military defeat was accelerated by human cyber warfare that disrupted trade networks and caused supply chain failures throughout assembly space. President Yoonji Kang stood before the emergency session of what remained of the Galactic Assembly as she delivered Earth's final ultimatum to the broken alliance that had murdered humanity's closest friends. The once magnificent assembly chamber was now half empty as dozens of member species had withdrawn rather than face human retaliation, while those who remained sat in fearful silence. Her words carried the weight of absolute military superiority as she outlined the terms that would end the war and establish a new order based on justice rather than the systematic oppression that had characterized assembly rule. Grand Admiral Taehyung Park commanded the human fleet that surrounded the assembly capital world in a demonstration of power that left no doubt about Earth's ability to enforce its demands. The ships that hung in space above the planetary surface represented the culmination of decades of secret military development, combined with technology captured from defeated assembly forces. Each vessel was a masterpiece of human engineering that incorporated lessons learned from studying alien weaknesses while demonstrating capabilities that seemed to violate known laws of physics. Diplomat Ji-hye Yoon sat in the prosecutor's chair at the War Crimes Tribunal that would determine the fate of assembly leaders responsible for the Valoran genocide and decades of planned atrocities against peaceful species. As the sister of Lieutenant Ji-won Yoon, who had survived the massacre, she carried a personal connection to the tragedy while representing Earth's demand for justice. The evidence gathered by human intelligence operations painted a picture of systematic evil that shocked even veteran diplomats who thought they understood the depths of political corruption. General Min Seok Choi prepared for Operation Final Justice as human forces positioned themselves for simultaneous assaults on every remaining assembly stronghold throughout the galaxy. The plan represented the culmination of everything Earth had learned about warfare during the 18-month campaign that had brought the mightiest alliance in galactic history to its knees. Each target had been carefully selected to maximize psychological impact while minimizing civilian casualties in keeping with human principles of proportional response. The Assembly High Council listened in stunned silence as President Kang outlined Earth's demands for complete dissolution of their government and the establishment of a new galactic confederation based on voluntary cooperation rather than coerced submission. War crimes trials would be conducted for all individuals responsible for atrocities, while reparations would be paid to species that had suffered under assembly oppression. The moderate council members realized these terms offered them a chance to survive and rebuild, while the Krex representatives saw only humiliation and defeat. General Vex of the Krex Coalition rose from his seat to reject the human ultimatum with a speech filled with rage and defiance that demonstrated the violent nature his species was known for throughout the galaxy. He declared that the Krex would never submit to inferior beings who lacked the strength to rule and called upon remaining assembly forces to unite for one final assault that would drive humanity back to their insignificant homeworld. His words sealed the fate of everyone who chose to follow his path of continued resistance rather than accepting the mercy Earth offered. Grand Admiral Tae-hyung Park received authorization to begin the final assault as assembly leadership split between those who accepted surrender and die-hard factions that chose to fight until the end. The military operation that followed demonstrated the full scope of human capabilities as forces struck simultaneously across hundreds of light years with coordination that seemed impossible according to traditional understanding of space warfare. Each attack was precisely calibrated to destroy military resistance while sparing civilian populations who bore no responsibility for their leaders' crimes. Diplomat Ji-hye Yoon presented evidence to the War Crimes Tribunal that revealed the systematic nature of assembly atrocities extending far beyond the Valoran massacre to include planned genocides against dozens of peaceful species. The documentation captured from intelligence facilities showed lists of targets scheduled for elimination, along with detailed studies of how to exploit their biological and psychological weaknesses. The scope of evil was so vast that several tribunal judges required medical attention after reviewing the complete files. General Min Seok Choi led the assault on Assembly Military Command, while his forces demonstrated the terrifying efficiency of human soldiers fighting with cold calculating fury rather than mindless rage. The Krex defenders found themselves facing enemies who anticipated their every move while responding with tactics that seemed designed to break their spirit as much as their military capacity. Human troops showed mercy to those who surrendered, while pursuing fleeing commanders with relentless determination that left no hiding place safe. The climax of the final battle occurred when General Vex made his last stand in the command bunker beneath Assembly Capital while his remaining forces crumbled around him. The Krex commander had spent his entire life believing that strength came through conquest and violence, but found himself defeated by enemies who fought with discipline and purpose he could not comprehend. As human soldiers breached his final defenses, he realized that humanity's terrifying effectiveness came not from superior technology, but from their ability to channel pure rage into tactical perfection. President Yoon Ji-kang addressed the defeated Assembly leadership as they formally surrendered and agreed to face justice for their crimes against galactic civilization. The woman who had hoped to resolve the crisis through diplomacy had been forced to wage the most brutal war in galactic history, but she took no pleasure in victory achieved through such terrible means. Her words to the prisoners were simple and direct, as she explained that justice delayed would not be justice denied, regardless of how long it took to achieve. Diplomat Ji-hye-yoon oversaw the war crimes trials that followed as Earth established new standards of international law based on human concepts of proportional justice and protection for innocent populations. The proceedings were broadcast throughout the galaxy to ensure that every species understood the consequences of targeting civilians, while the testimony of survivors provided evidence that could not be disputed or explained away. Many Assembly officials chose to cooperate with investigations rather than face the full penalties for their participation in systematic atrocities. Grand Admiral Tae-hyung Park directed the massive humanitarian operation that followed military victory as human forces worked to rebuild worlds devastated by Assembly oppression and the recent war. Earth's medical technology was shared freely, while engineering teams helped restore infrastructure destroyed during the fighting. The contrast between human behavior in victory and Assembly conduct during their period of dominance was not lost on populations throughout the galaxy who had expected conquest rather than assistance. General Min Seok Choi established security forces composed of volunteers from liberated worlds who worked alongside human peacekeepers to maintain order during the transition to new governmental systems. The former enemies who chose cooperation over continued resistance found themselves treated with respect and dignity that they had never experienced under Assembly rule. Even Krex prisoners were given opportunities to demonstrate that their species could learn to value peace over violence when properly motivated. The new Galactic Confederation that emerged from the ashes of Assembly tyranny was based on voluntary participation and mutual benefit rather than coerced submission to central authority. Each member species retained autonomy over their internal affairs while agreeing to common standards for the treatment of civilians and the resolution of disputes. Earth took on the role of guarantor for the new system, but made it clear that leadership would be shared among all member races according to their contributions and capabilities. President Yoon Kang delivered her final speech as the architect of humanity's victory while standing before the memorial to Valoran Prime that had been established on every human world. The beautiful sculpture captured the peaceful nature of the species that had been humanity's first galactic friends while serving as a reminder of the price paid for justice. Her words honored the memory of those who had died while warning future generations about the consequences of threatening innocent populations under human protection. 5 years after the end of the war, the galaxy had achieved a level of peace and prosperity that exceeded anything experienced during Assembly rule, as trade flourished between species that had been oppressed enemies under the old system. The technologies and knowledge that had been hoarded by Assembly elites were now shared freely, while conflicts between different races were resolved through mediation rather than military conquest. Earth's reputation as protector of the innocent had become legendary throughout known space. Diplomat Ji-hye-yoon served as Earth's representative to the Confederation Council, where she worked to prevent the emergence of new threats to galactic stability while building on the foundations laid during the Reconstruction period. The lessons learned from Assembly atrocities had been incorporated into new laws and institutions designed to protect vulnerable populations while ensuring that no single species could dominate others through military force or economic manipulation.